"Ma'am, I'm sorry, but your name isn't on the guest list." Those were the words that shattered a dream I had carried in my heart for 35 years. I stood frozen on the stone steps of St. Andrew's Church in upstate New York, clutching the small silver gift box I had wrapped the night before. Around me, guests in elegant suits and pastel dresses moved through the tall wooden doors with bright smiles and excited laughter. The church bells echoed across the street, announcing the beginning of my son's wedding. My son's wedding. A day I had imagined since the moment I first held him in my arms. "There must be a mistake," I said quietly. The young woman at the entrance checked her tablet again. Her smile faded into an uncomfortable expression. "I'm sorry. I checked twice. Margaret Collins isn't listed." For a second I thought I had misheard her. I looked past her into the sanctuary. White roses lined the aisle. Soft violin music drifted through the open doors. Everything looked exactly as I had imagined it would. Everything except for one thing. There was no place for me. I glanced down at the pale blue dress I had spent weeks choosing. Daniel always said blue was my color. When he was 8 years old, he once told me I looked like a movie star when I wore a blue sweater. I remembered that silly comment while standing there, suddenly feeling foolish for caring. The gift box felt heavier in my hands. Inside was a gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father. My husband had worn it every Sunday for 27 years. Before he passed away, he told me, "Give it to Daniel on the most important day of his life." I had waited nearly a decade to fulfill that promise. Now I wasn't even allowed through the front door. The church parking lot buzzed with conversation. Guests greeted each other warmly. Some nodded politely as they walked by me, unaware that the mother of the groom was standing outside like a stranger. I took a slow breath and forced myself to remain calm. At 69, I had learned that dignity often begins with silence. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Through the doorway I could see the front row. The seat reserved for the groom's mother was empty. A white ribbon was tied neatly around it. No purse. No flowers. No place card. Just an empty chair waiting for someone who had apparently never been invited. I stared at it for several seconds. The empty chair seemed to tell a story nobody else could hear. A story of conversations held behind closed doors. Decisions made without me. Months of distance I had tried to ignore. I wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. I wanted to believe my son would appear any moment, shocked to find me standing outside. But deep down, a quiet voice was beginning to whisper something I wasn't ready to accept. This wasn't a mistake. And as the church doors slowly closed, I realized the wedding wasn't where this story began. It had started many months earlier, with small moments I dismissed, small changes I refused to see, and one woman who seemed determined to erase me from my own son's life. As I stood across the street from the church, watching guests disappear behind those heavy wooden doors, my mind drifted back to a time when none of this seemed possible. There was a time when Daniel called me every Sunday afternoon without fail. No matter how busy he was, my phone would ring around 3 o'clock, and I would hear the same cheerful voice asking how my week had been. After my husband passed away 9 years earlier, those calls became a lifeline. We talked about everything and nothing. The weather, his work, a new restaurant he had discovered, the Yankees, holiday plans, ordinary conversations that made the distance between Albany and Manhattan feel smaller. When Daniel first introduced me to Vanessa, I genuinely wanted to welcome her into our family. She was polished, confident, and successful. She carried herself with the kind of self-assurance I admired. During our first dinner together, she brought me a bouquet of white lilies because she remembered me mentioning they had been my husband's favorite flowers. I thought it was thoughtful. I thought Daniel had found someone kind. Looking back, I wonder if I simply saw what I wanted to see. The changes happened slowly, almost too slowly to notice. The weekly phone calls became every other week, then once a month. When I invited them for Sunday dinner, Vanessa often had other plans. There was always a reason. A business event. A dinner with friends. A weekend getaway. None of it seemed unusual on its own. Life changes when people fall in love. I understood that. What I did not understand was why I increasingly felt like a guest in my son's life instead of his mother. The first time it truly stung was during the engagement celebration. Vanessa's parents sat beside Daniel at the head table, while I was seated near distant relatives I barely knew. Daniel apologized afterward and said the seating chart had been complicated. I smiled and told him not to worry. Then came the wedding planning. I learned about the venue after it had already been booked. I saw photos of dress fittings online instead of receiving an invitation. Family group messages appeared without my name included. Whenever I asked a question, the answers were polite but brief. Everything seemed carefully designed to keep me informed but never involved. One evening about 3 months before the wedding, I called Daniel to ask if he wanted the old family photo albums for the rehearsal dinner slideshow. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said they had already finished the presentation. I remember standing in my kitchen staring at the refrigerator covered with photographs from his childhood. Little league games, school plays, camping trips, hundreds of memories. None of them had been needed. That night, for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder whether I was being pushed aside. But I quickly dismissed the thought. After all, this was my son, the boy I had raised, the boy who used to leave handmade Mother's Day cards on my pillow before sunrise. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Standing outside that church now, I realized the signs had been there all along. I simply had not wanted to believe what they were trying to tell me. The church bells continued ringing somewhere behind me, but they sounded distant now, as if they belonged to another life. I sat down on a wooden bench across the street and placed the silver gift box beside me. Cars filled the parking lot. More guests arrived, smiling and carrying wrapped presents. Every few minutes the church doors opened, revealing flashes of white flowers and warm light before closing again. I found myself staring at my phone. No missed calls. No messages. Nothing from Daniel. Nothing from anyone. The silence felt heavier than any explanation could have. About 20 minutes later, a familiar voice spoke my name. Aunt Margaret. I looked up and saw Emily hurrying toward me in low heels, holding one hand against the wind. Her expression changed the moment she saw my face. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. For a second I considered pretending everything was fine. It was a habit I had developed over many years. But the words would not come. Instead I simply said, "Apparently I am not invited." Emily stared at me as though she had misheard. "What do you mean?" I explained what had happened at the entrance. As I spoke, her eyes widened. When I finished, she looked toward the church and then back at me. "That does not make any sense," she said quietly. "Everyone knows you are Daniel's mother." I managed a faint smile. "Apparently not everyone." Emily sat beside me. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then she took a deep breath. "There is something I think you should know." The way she said it immediately made my stomach tighten. I turned toward her. "What is it?" She hesitated. "I was not sure if I should tell you. I thought maybe I was imagining things." My heart sank. Those were almost the exact words I had been telling myself for months. Emily looked down at her hands before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I heard Vanessa talking to some of the bridesmaids. They were discussing family seating arrangements." She paused. "One of them asked why you were not included in several wedding events." I felt my chest grow tight. "And?" Emily looked uncomfortable. "Vanessa said you preferred staying away from family gatherings because you did not approve of the marriage." For a moment I could not respond. The statement was so far from the truth that it sounded absurd. I had spent months defending Vanessa whenever friends questioned her behavior. I had mailed engagement gifts, sent cards, offered help. "I never said that," I whispered. "I know." Emily nodded immediately. "That is why it bothered me." A cold realization began settling over me. Not all at once. Slowly, like snow accumulating on a rooftop. One conversation, one misunderstanding, one false impression at a time. Suddenly dozens of awkward moments from the previous year began fitting together. The missing invitations, the distant replies, the uncomfortable looks from people I barely knew. I had assumed everyone was busy. Now I wondered how many of them had been hearing a completely different story about me. Across the street, the church doors opened once more. Guests entered smiling, completely unaware that a different ceremony had already taken place long before today. A quiet campaign, a careful rewriting of who I was. And for the first time I began to suspect that being left off the guest list was not the beginning of the problem. It was simply the final result. Emily and I remained on that bench while the wedding ceremony unfolded behind closed doors. The November air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and a cold breeze swept across the street. I tightened my coat around my shoulders and stared at the church windows glowing softly in the afternoon light. For years, I had believed that truth had a way of revealing itself eventually. Sitting there beside Emily, I began wondering how much of the truth I had missed. "There is more," Emily said quietly. I turned toward her. She looked uncomfortable, as though she regretted being the one forced to say it. A few months ago, Vanessa hosted a bridal luncheon. Some relatives from both families were there. She paused before continuing. "Your name came up several times." I felt my chest tighten again. "What did she say?" Emily hesitated. "She told people you struggled with letting Daniel make his own decisions. She said you called constantly and tried to control his life." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Not because it was funny, but because it was the exact opposite of reality. During the previous year, I had often waited weeks before reaching out because I did not want to interrupt his busy schedule. Did anyone believe her? I asked. Emily looked away toward the church. That was answer enough. Suddenly I remembered a family barbecue from the summer before. One of Daniel's cousins had seemed distant. Another relative barely spoke to me. At the time I assumed they were distracted. Now I wondered whether they had already formed opinions about me, based on stories I never knew existed. Memory after memory resurfaced. At Thanksgiving, Vanessa had jokingly told everyone that I still treated Daniel like a teenager. The table laughed politely. I laughed too. Looking back, I realized nobody else understood it was not a joke. At Christmas, she casually mentioned that I struggled with change and had difficulty accepting new family members. Again I smiled and said nothing because arguing over small comments seemed pointless. Perhaps that had been my mistake. Small comments become larger stories when repeated often enough. Why would she do this? I finally asked. Emily was silent for several seconds. "I think she wanted to be the center of everything," she said. "And sometimes people see family relationships as competition instead of connection." Her words lingered in my mind. Competition. I had never viewed Vanessa as competition. I was Daniel's mother. She was the woman he loved. There should have been room for both of us. Across the street, guests began gathering near the church entrance. The ceremony was ending. Smiles appeared. Cameras flashed. Laughter drifted through the air. Everyone seemed happy. I watched from a distance, feeling strangely calm. The hurt was still there, but something else had begun taking shape beneath it. Clarity. For months I had blamed myself. I had wondered whether I was too sensitive, too old-fashioned, too involved, or not involved enough. Sitting beside Emily, I realized something important. You cannot solve a problem when you have been given the wrong explanation. And for a very long time, I had been blaming myself for wounds someone else had carefully created. After the ceremony ended, guests slowly began moving toward the reception hall a few blocks away. Emily offered to drive me home, but I was not ready to sit alone with my thoughts yet. Instead, we stopped at a small coffee shop near the river. It was the kind of place my husband and I used to visit on Saturday mornings. I ordered tea. Emily ordered coffee. Neither of us touched our drinks for several minutes. Outside the window, families walked along the sidewalk, laughing and carrying shopping bags. Ordinary scenes. Ordinary lives. Mine no longer felt ordinary. Emily finally broke the silence. "There is one more thing I never told you." I looked up. The seriousness in her voice immediately caught my attention. "Last month I helped Vanessa organize some reception materials," she said. "Guest lists, seating charts, welcome packets. Things like that." I waited. "At one point, your name was included." My fingers tightened slightly around the warm teacup. "Included?" She nodded. "You had a seat. Not in the front row, but you were there." For a moment, hope flickered inside me. Maybe Daniel had wanted me there after all. Maybe something had changed at the last minute. Then Emily continued. "A week later, I noticed your name was gone." The hope disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. "Did anyone say why?" Emily shook her head. "Not directly. But I remember Vanessa telling one of her friends that some people bring unnecessary drama into important moments." She looked at me carefully. I knew she meant you. I stared out the window. Cars moved slowly through the afternoon traffic. A delivery truck stopped at a red light. Somewhere across town, wedding guests were probably raising glasses and celebrating. The contrast felt strange. Their day was moving forward. Mine had stopped completely. Did Daniel know? I asked quietly. Emily hesitated. I do not know. That answer hurt more than certainty would have. If he knew, he had allowed it. If he did not know, then he had become so disconnected from me that someone else was making decisions about our relationship. Neither possibility offered much comfort. As the afternoon passed, I found myself remembering a conversation from 6 months earlier. Daniel and I had been having lunch together when he suddenly asked whether I ever felt lonely living by myself. At the time, I thought he was simply concerned. Now the memory felt different, almost as though he had been testing a narrative someone else had planted. Looking back, many conversations carried that same feeling. Small questions, gentle assumptions, tiny shifts in perception. None of them seemed significant alone. Together, they painted a picture I no longer recognized. Emily reached across the table and touched my hand. I am sorry, she said. I nodded. So am I. But the sadness I felt was changing. Earlier that day, I had been overwhelmed by confusion. Now something else was taking its place. Not anger. Not revenge. Awareness. For months I had been trying to earn back a place that had quietly been taken from me. And for the first time I began wondering whether the real question was not why I had been excluded today. The real question was how long someone had been working to make sure this day would happen exactly this way. When I finally returned home that evening, the house felt unusually quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet I had grown accustomed to after my husband's passing, but a different kind. The kind that arrives after something important has ended. I placed the unopened gift box on the dining room table and hung my coat by the door. For several minutes I simply stood there, looking around at the familiar room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Daniel at age 6 holding a fishing pole twice his height. Daniel at his high school graduation. Daniel standing beside his father at a Yankees game many years ago. Every picture told the same story. We had been a family. No one could erase that, no matter how hard they tried. My phone remained silent throughout the evening. No message. No explanation. No apology. I told myself not to check it every few minutes, yet I kept reaching for it anyway. Around 8 o'clock, I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat beside the living room window. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting through the darkness. The weather forecast had predicted the first light snowfall of the season. Normally, I would have called Daniel to tell him. He always loved the first snow. Instead, I sat alone watching it fall. Then, shortly after 9 o'clock, my phone finally rang. My heart jumped the moment I saw his name on the screen. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Not out of anger, out of self-preservation. But I answered. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded tired. In the background, I could hear music and distant conversation. The reception was still underway. Hello, Daniel. There was a brief silence. I heard there was some confusion at the church today. Confusion. The word landed heavily between us. I stared out at the falling snow and closed my eyes. Confusion. I repeated softly. That is what you call it? Another pause followed. Vanessa told me there was a problem with the guest list. I felt something inside me settle. Not break. Settle. Like a puzzle piece finally finding its place. Daniel, I said carefully, did you know I was not invited? The line became silent. Long enough to tell me everything before he even spoke. I thought it had been handled. Handled. Not corrected. Not questioned. Handled. Suddenly I understood something that had taken me months to see. This was never about one missing invitation or one wedding ceremony. It was about 1,000 moments when silence became easier than truth. 1,000 moments when someone else spoke for me while I remained unaware. I see, I said quietly. Mom. His voice carried uncertainty now, perhaps even regret. But I was too tired to untangle it. Enjoy your evening, Daniel. Can we talk tomorrow? He asked quickly. I looked at the photographs surrounding me. The life I had spent decades building. The memories nobody could rewrite. Yes, I said. Tomorrow. After we ended the call, I placed the phone face down on the table and sat quietly for a long time. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, for the first time all day, I felt something unexpected. Not relief. Not happiness. Clarity. Because tomorrow would bring answers. And whether those answers healed anything or not, I was finally ready to hear the truth. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The snow from the night before had covered the neighborhood in a thin white blanket, softening the edges of driveways and rooftops. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the quiet street. For years, mornings had been my favorite time of day. They felt full of possibility. This one felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of something I could not yet see. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Daniel arrived. When I opened the door, he looked older than he had the week before. The excitement of the wedding day was gone. In its place was exhaustion. He stepped inside and glanced around the house as though seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the family photographs lining the hallway. "Thank you for agreeing to talk," he said. I nodded and led him into the living room. Neither of us sat down immediately. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Daniel lowered himself into a chair across from me. "Mom, I need you to know I never wanted to hurt you." I listened without speaking. "Vanessa told me there had been tension between you two for a long time. She said you felt uncomfortable attending. She said you wanted space." I stared at him. Not because I was shocked anymore, but because I was trying to understand how such a story had survived without being questioned. "And you believed that?" I asked gently. Daniel looked down at his hands. At first I did not. But over time, his voice trailed off. Over time, those two words explained everything. Not one lie. Not one dramatic accusation. Just a steady stream of suggestions repeated often enough to sound true. I stood and walked toward the bookshelf. On the top shelf sat a framed photograph taken 15 years earlier. Daniel and I were smiling beside a lake during a family vacation. His father stood between us with one arm around each of our shoulders. I handed the picture to him. "Tell me what you see." Daniel studied it. "Us." "Exactly," I replied. "Not conflict. Not competition. Not someone trying to control your life. Just a family." His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then something changed in his expression. It was subtle, but I recognized it immediately. Doubt. Not doubt about me. Doubt about everything he had accepted without examining. "Emily told me some things yesterday," I said carefully. Daniel looked up. "What things?" I explained what she had shared about the guest list, the comments, and the stories that had circulated among relatives. As I spoke, the color slowly drained from his face. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back heavily and rubbed his forehead. "I did not know any of that," he whispered. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely shaken. Outside, snow slid quietly from a tree branch and disappeared into the yard below. Inside, another kind of weight had begun to shift. Not enough to repair what had happened. Not yet. But enough to reveal a truth that had been hidden for far too long. Daniel stayed for nearly 2 hours. Most of that time was spent looking through old photographs and listening rather than speaking. I did not attack him. I did not demand explanations. There was little value in either. The truth was already doing its work. Before he left, he asked a question that lingered with me long after the front door closed behind him. "Mom, why did you never tell me any of this?" First, I thought the answer was simple. I did not know. But as the afternoon light faded across the living room, I realized there was more to it. For years, I had believed that love meant giving people room to make their own choices. I thought if I remained patient, kind, and respectful, misunderstandings would eventually correct themselves. I had underestimated how powerful repeated stories could become when left unchallenged. Around 5 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. Normally I would have ignored it, but something prompted me to answer. "Mrs. Collins?" a man asked politely. "This is Robert Gaines. I handled several estate matters for your late husband." I immediately recognized the name. Robert had been my husband's attorney and trusted friend for more than 20 years. We had not spoken in quite some time. "Of course," I said. "How are you?" "I am well," he replied. "I was actually trying to reach you because I recently came across something your husband asked me to keep on file." My heart skipped slightly. Something on file? Yes. A personal letter. He instructed me to deliver it only if I ever believed family relationships had become strained after his passing. I sat down slowly. Across the room, snow reflected pale evening light through the window. A letter. I repeated. From my husband? Robert's voice softened. He was very specific. He said there might come a day when people forgot what mattered most. He wanted his words available if that day ever arrived. For several seconds I could not speak. 9 years had passed since I lost him, yet somehow his presence still found ways to appear when I needed it most. Robert explained that he would bring the letter personally the following morning. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence. My eyes drifted toward the unopened gift box still resting on the dining room table. The gold pocket watch inside had belonged to my husband. It had survived decades of use. Family vacations, holidays, ordinary afternoons. It had measured time faithfully while lives changed around it. Suddenly I found myself wondering whether my husband had seen something long before I did. Whether he understood that families are not usually broken by one dramatic event. More often they are changed by small compromises, quiet omissions, and truths left unspoken. Later that evening another message arrived. It was from Daniel. Only a few words. I am starting to understand. I am sorry. I read the message twice before setting the phone aside. Outside, fresh snow continued covering the world in white. Inside, a different layer was beginning to lift. For the first time since that painful day at the church, it felt as though hidden pieces of the story were finally moving into place. And somehow, I sensed that my husband's letter would change far more than either of us expected. The following morning, Robert arrived precisely at 10 o'clock carrying a thin manila envelope. Snow still covered the lawn, sparkling beneath a pale winter sun. We sat together at the dining room table where my husband and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. Robert carefully placed the envelope in front of me. My hands trembled slightly as I recognized my husband's handwriting on the front. 9 years had passed, yet seeing those familiar letters felt like hearing his voice again. I opened the envelope slowly and unfolded the pages inside. The letter was not long. It did not contain legal instructions or financial information. Instead, it contained something far more valuable. Wisdom. My husband wrote about family. He wrote about mistakes people make when pride replaces communication. He wrote about how easy it is for misunderstandings to grow when good people stop asking honest questions. One sentence stood out above all the others. If the people I love ever find themselves choosing sides, remind them that family is not a competition. Love is not a limited resource. I read that line 3 times. Across the table, Robert remained silent. He understood some moments do not need commentary. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by again. This time I handed him the letter. He sat quietly and read every word. When he finished, he stared at the final page for a long time. "Dad wrote this for us," he finally said. "I think he did," I replied. Daniel nodded slowly. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the photographs, the furniture, the life that had existed long before recent events. I spent so much time trying to keep the peace that I stopped asking whether the story I was hearing was true, he admitted. There was sadness in his voice but also honesty. For the first time in many months, I felt like I was speaking to my son again, rather than a stranger repeating someone else's opinions. We talked for hours. Not about blame. Not about winning or losing. We talked about facts. About conversations that never happened. Assumptions that were never questioned. Decisions that should have involved both of us. By the time evening arrived, neither of us could change what had happened. The wedding day would always remain part of our story. The empty chair. The closed church doors. The silence. None of it could be erased. But something else happened that day. Truth finally entered the room. In the weeks that followed, difficult conversations continued. Some relationships healed. Others remained complicated. Life rarely offers perfect endings. Yet one thing became clear. The seat they took from me had never defined my place in the family. A guest list could be changed. A chair could be left empty. A name could be removed from a ceremony. But 35 years of love, sacrifice, memories, and devotion could not be erased by anyone. On a quiet evening several months later, I placed the gold pocket watch on a shelf beside my husband's photograph. The wedding had come and gone. The snow had melted. Spring was returning to New York. As sunlight filled the room, I realized something important. They had excluded me from a single day. What they could never take away was an entire lifetime. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt at peace.